With Master Mode seemingly just around the corner, I want to, in this video, give a brief summary as to the combat differences in Master Modes versus what we have in the current live 3.22.1 build of Star Citizen. Firstly, in Master Modes, we now have lower speeds. There's a firing cone. Think of this like your weapon spread in other video games. There's higher TTK, spherical geometry, which feels very arcadey except maybe in ships like the Medai Fury, which has rotating thrusters. Then in live, we have higher speeds, we have pinpoint fire, a lower TTK, and we have dimensional geometry. Think of this like your sim thrusters being added together. So the question becomes, why Master Modes? Well, it's not intended to lower the skill ceiling, it's just kind of a side effect. Higher speed merges such as spearing are a common accident for inexperienced pilots. Your pip accuracy trade-offs are that highly accurate pips are only accurate initially, and your target can actually dodge after the line of fire has been established. Bullet travel time also allows enemies to evade incoming fire. The smaller and faster a target is, the easier it is for that target to evade incoming fire. This is because it'll need to move less due to a smaller cross-section, and it can accelerate more because of its lower mass. This implies, and in live it shows, that more skilled pilots can evade most, if not all, incoming fire if in a small enough ship relative to their opponent. This is more commonly known as the light fighter meta, which can be beaten in the current state of live if up against a skilled multi-crew team. So, what are the effects of lower speeds in Master Modes? Master Modes now can make fighters max out their velocities in about 2 seconds of acceleration, while some can achieve this in as low as 1. This causes the direction of flight to quickly become inaccessible to further acceleration. In other words, a non-accelerating ship is indistinguishable from a ship that's standing still. Think of this like non-accelerating frames of reference. The effect of this is that the firing solution generated by the pip remains accurate during projectile travel times unless the target moves off its vector. This implies that the target would have to turn 180 degrees every time it accelerates to maximum velocity. This is very difficult as rotating takes almost as long as accelerating from negative max velocity to positive max velocity, which is about 2 to 4 seconds. This also implies that the emergent form of combat is short-turn reversals every few seconds with lower combat radii, which we do currently see in the Arena Commander Master Modes playlist. The other option is to maintain the same vector and suffer lower acceleration in the direction of momentum, which will almost certainly lead you to looking at the regen screen halfway across the system from where you died. The result of all this is that pilots who rely on evading are severely negatively impacted due to the vulnerability that results from constantly having to turn while being momentarily stationary to incoming fire. This in turn results in a combat environment where it's almost never advantageous to lose time on target, which makes combat a DPS race reliant on hull HP rather than a dogfight. So, what are the effects of less evasiveness and shorter acceleration times? Dogfights have turned into close quarters fights that are head-on, more akin to an FPS game rather than a space or flight sim. Bullets travel very fast relative to the shooter's movement speed, which results in target evasion being far less important to whether a shot lands than the accuracy of the one shooting. Changing directions in absolute terms takes less time. Lower relative velocity compared to the environment means that you're less likely to collide with the environment unintentionally. However, this also means that you are much more likely to successfully collide with the environment intentionally, such as players ramming other ships when they feel they can't win the fight. This is a common occurrence in the Arena Commander Master Modes playlist and anything larger than the Vanguard. Master Modes in turn will feel far more familiar to new players rather than those who are currently in the live build. Master Modes, however, becomes a very inaccurate depiction of space flight as a consequence. This removes what might possibly be the main distinguishing factor of Star Citizen as it relates to other games. As a consequence, Star Citizen now feels like every other arcadey space game and feels like Starfield space combat, which, by the way, is non-engaging and a monotonous bout of being nose-on with limited mobility and just spraying. The problems with feedback, master modes being pushed on players in other words, is that master modes, well, it does make some technical problems far easier to solve. Lots of infrastructure already supports your FPS style gameplay with lower movement and engagement speed and time. Things that were expensive are now cheap in the sense of big ticket items. More server hubs can be brought online as CIG will not have to have new servers. This allows CIG to balance server ping against a player's position at lower speeds, which allows people at greater distances away from servers having a more playable experience. This is an example of solving a technical challenge with limiting gameplay, which is directly contrary to CIG's ethos to solve technical problems with innovative technical approaches, for example, dynamic server meshing. Master modes also has an effect on weapons. Random spread results in slightly random DPS. As players approach the same time on target, assuming the opponents are of same skill, the deciding factor between the opponents depends on whose weapon have better RNG. Combat becomes frustrating and unengaging as the weapon tends to have a mind of its own and does not rely on the pilot aiming or the pip location. Increasing ship HP pool while at the same time increasing ammo count also does not count as increasing ammo, rather it just cancels itself out. Weapon DPS is far too low to quickly damage other light fighters with a light fighter, and cheats such as aimbots will now become almost impossible to overcome as one cannot maneuver out of the line of fire. Multi-crew also has a set of very specific problems in master modes. There's a major incentive in master modes to maximize your DPS. Roles that previously complemented now directly compete with each other. There is now far less emphasis on teamwork and strategy. The I fly you gun theory, like my brother and I do, is no longer viable. Currently in live this works. It is far better to work with the gunner and sacrifice pilot time on target than it is to focus on pilot aiming. This is a true multi-crew strategy and it seems pretty much unbeatable, but it is heavily reliant on trust and compatibility between the pilot and the gunner. Think of the dual pilots of the Jaegers from Pacific Rim.
Only listen to me!
It's loosely like that. This dynamic does not work in master modes, however. Turrets more often fire in line with the nose of the ship instead of using their ability to engage opponents in off-angle fights. This results in gunners being left the silent losers in master modes as it takes away one of the key assets at their disposal and in turn makes that position feel like a far inferior role to piloting a light fighter. Ships such as the Scorpius and Hurricane will lose a lot of fun characteristics. Pilot-gunner roles have far less dynamic contrast in combat, which results in far less availability for unique approaches, which results in a more standardized flying and fighting from team to team. The current state of master modes has only fortified the light fighter meta, which can be seen by the fact that we're able to eliminate the exact same Vanguard from earlier by using 2 Gladiuses. Then we have your sub-capital and capital ship killers. Hit and run tactics are going to become far less useful. Ships like the Inferno and Ion will no longer have a viable role within Star Citizen. And that's because the speeds in master modes are just far too low for these heavy fighters to dodge the Sea Whiz or fighter screenings that's on sub-capital and capital ships while they come in for their gun runs. The main battery of these ships might even be able to intercept the Inferno and Ion as they close in for their strafing runs. So CIG, just delete the ship from the game and refund the money to those who bought it, as it seems like they're now just in-game paperweights. So what exactly is the problem with numbers? The game may feel more accessible, but it's going to become far less accessible in practice. And that's because most new players fly solo. This is clear given that most starters on the Pledge store are single-seaters. Established players are far more frequently going to have at minimum one wingman or are going to be part of an org. Contrary to what some people are saying, new players will almost always lose in PvP, as most experienced PvP players fly in pairs or in full teams of light fighters. There's also no incentive to improve at dogfighting, just get nose on, which seems more like an incentive to either pair up or quit the game. Master Modes loses all the cool flight mechanics that once brought and kept the current player base in the game, in exchange for the very thing that we wanted to leave, an arcadey, limiting space, and flight sim. When people watch dogfights, they typically turn to games like DCS and Star Citizen. Like, when was the last time anyone sat down and watched a monotonous ship battle in Starfield? So it's not how to improve master modes, rather how to improve the problems master modes tries to. Lower shield strength drastically, but make shields constantly regenerate. Larger ships should regenerate shields fast enough even while taking damage that smaller weapons aren't viable unless in high quantity. Think of a fleet of light fighters. This works like gated damage reduction under some threshold. Shields are undamaged, but above that threshold, shields work like damage reduction. For example, pistols are ineffective against light fighters, and CF-227s would be ineffective against subcapital ships. Big and slow ships like the Perseus, 890, and Idris eventually, rely on superior regeneration, while small and nimble ships rely on evasion and groups. This effectively means that smaller ships can be outgunned by larger ships, but could remain dangerous to large ships by cooperating in groups. Secondly, we can make smaller weapons have shorter ranges than larger weapons. For small ships to engage a large target, it should have to be in close proximity and not be invulnerable by moving just a slight amount at 1 to 2 kilometers of range. Keep SCM speeds at 1 kilometers a second. Period. Nav mode. Big ships should require high speeds for scale. Acceleration is slower though for those ships, but give big ships higher top speeds than smaller ships. Fuel obeys the square cube law. Ship volume grows faster than ship surface area, so more volume, more fuel. More fuel, higher top speed. So the question becomes, should we keep different flight envelopes? Well, the current flight model feels bad. Overall acceleration is lower for heavy fighters. This is far more of a problem than it is for light fighters. Pitch and yaw feel extremely unnatural. The highest acceleration vector possible moves in a semisphere around the craft, which makes very little sense considering the main engines do not point in any direction other than the rear. This has a deeply negative effect on the predictability and naturalness of the craft. The original three-dimensional freedom, commonly referred to as tricording, not only feels better, it also makes physical sense. Thrusters should also behave proportional to their size. Spaceflight should absolutely not perform like atmospheric flight. They are very different. Spaceflight relies on navigating all three dimensions far more than atmospheric flight does. Pitch and yaw should not differ in space drastically, but thrusters may slightly prefer pitch or yaw if they struggle to vector, but this depends on the thruster placement. There are no aerodynamics in space. It's a vacuum. It's not atmospheric. Wind resistance does not apply in the dark, scary depths of space. So how do we actually improve accessibility? Well, firstly, just don't underestimate the importance of an intuitive control scheme. Make bare minimum mappings for controllers, and don't bloat the controller schemes with every possible control, only include the essentials. Have better communication of essential information with fewer numbers and more symbolics. And then just have better player onboarding. Currently in the game, there's no way to learn how to dogfight. We have a very basic how to turn the ship on, but nothing that teaches a new player correct flight models. So, kind of an overview of what was just mentioned. Master modes, first and foremost, it just feels fake. It's less fun. There's less room for creativity. It's arcadey, and it's a first-person style of gameplay. Yeah, it is more immediately accessible, but there's far less to offer, like Starfield. There's less depth. There is less technical sophistication needed to implement it, which is good, but going fast is fun, even if it means losing control sometimes. 200 meters a second is just far too slow, and it plays this way considering most ships are a sizable portion of that scale. That is not to say big ships should not accelerate slower, they should. So, in general, Master Mode just simply isn't ready. Lastly, there's a loss of realism. The change to Master Modes abandons the most important aspect of Star Citizen's flight. Improving at flying in Star Citizen was highly rewarding because of Star Citizen's dedication to a realistic space flight. Abandoning this model abandons believability, an aspect Star Citizen did better than every other space game. It felt like you were actually improving at a real skill. It felt like you were flying against real opponents. You could get lost in the experience. You weren't constantly reminded that you were playing a game. In Master Modes, it does just that. It constantly reminds you that what you're doing is not real. You hit arbitrary speed limits. you are constantly switching in and out of nav modes. It's extremely unnatural in terms of its flight response across the board, and the weapon effectiveness is seemingly random. So, with all of that being said, if you found this video to be informative or you find yourself agreeing with a lot of what I said, be sure to share this. The only way to get CIG's attention to possibly prevent master modes from coming out, or maybe even to change it drastically, is to share this video. I know Avenger1 made a video about this as well. He shares a lot of the same concerns that we share. Watch his video. I highly recommend it. And again, share his, share mine, get this out there so that CIG has to watch it to see the actual concerns of their player base.